here in Amesbury. The last sermon I gave was on the Three Kings, and I was surprised the next day to see this cartoon appearing in the Times. I think it's indicative of the times that we're in, that we will try to do and reach out and travel, but as the Three Kings, if they were to come today, would discover, like Novak Djokovic, it might not just be so easy to get into the country and out to the places you want to. But anyhow, let's move on. Today's topic is presenting your testimony, how to present your testimony. There was a man that Jesus met, but he couldn't see Jesus for the simple reason he was blind. Jesus healed him, and off he went. But then he was dragged in front of the council of the Jews, and they demanded to know what had happened. Now you must understand, Jesus sent this man away and told him to simply perform an act, and after that his eyes were opened. Jesus wasn't present, so he didn't know what Jesus looked like. And the Pharisees grilled the guy and said, "You're not really, this guy that you met, he was not a prophet, don't you believe it?" And the man said these simple words, "I was blind, but now I see." That is testimony. What was I like? This is what Jesus did for me. And someone has said that a man with a personal experience is never at the mercy of anyone who thinks they've got an argument. You can't argue if you've met Jesus with a personal experience, because Jesus' change in somebody's life is something that you can never work around. I'm going to ask you a question and see if you can get round it. Are we having difficulties here in this? Take this one off then. Turn it off. Right, okay, I have a question. And it's a fairly easy one, and let's see how well you know your Bibles. I want to know, who was Judas, Lebbaeus, Thaddaeus? If you know, shout out. Anybody know who Judas, Lebbaeus, Thaddaeus was? Come on, tell us, Barry. You'll not believe it. He was one of the 12 apostles. There you go. And he asked Jesus a question just after the Passover meal before he went out to be crucified. And Lebbaeus said to Jesus, "Lord, why do you intend to show yourself to us, but not to the world?" Do you know that is a really powerful question that we need to understand? Why isn't, what he was saying is, Jesus, when you go out, why don't you show yourself to the Pharisees and to Pontius Pilate? When he rose from the dead, why didn't he bang the door of the Roman Praetorium and go in and say, "Pontius Pilate, I'm back alive"? And there is a reason. He's not a showman to show miracles in terms of fantastic acts to force people to believe. He wants us to believe that we will hear someone give testimony, a message about Jesus, and believe that, and believe in him. And that is how the world will believe, through the message that one Christian will pass on to you or somebody else. Because God calls people who have not seen Jesus, like that blind man, to believe. And that is the whole secret of how we take the good news to others. So what does it mean? Fundamentally, it is our testimony that God intends to use to bring people to Jesus. If Billy Graham once said, do you know, if people could become Christians because an angel appeared from in front of them, God would have angels swinging from every lamppost in the country. But there's no point. An angel isn't a human being. It must be a human being that shares the human being's experience of the good news of what Jesus has done in your life that will bring someone else to faith in that same Jesus. That is the clue. And that is why we and all believers are to bear testimony. Well, here is a statement of what testimony is. and this is a dictionary definition from the Oxford Shorter Dictionary, that a testimony is a formal statement, especially given in a court. It is evidence or proof. And to testify means simply to give evidence as a witness in a court of law. And we saw that video at the start, which explained the use of the word in the Bible and how the same word testimony is the same word witness in the original. And Jesus has called us to be his witnesses. And the word martyr is the word in Greek. What does it mean to be witnesses, to give evidence? Well, what is evidence? It is information drawn from personal testimony. Let me give you a little bit of personal testimony. In 1978, I was riding my little motorbike along the streets of Belfast when, going past a police station, out pulled a car, and he didn't see me, and I smashed into him. I somersaulted and damaged my leg and ended up the road, and I was taken off in an ambulance to hospital. Well, sure enough, a year or so later, I appeared in this place along with the driver of that car, who, would you believe it, was a policeman who had just passed his advanced driving test with the police that very day. And he had driven out, and it was a dark, cold, wet night, and it was typical Belfast weather at that time of the year in January. But I appeared before the judge, and as I was giving evidence, they were going through what exactly happened, and I said, I did this, I did that, and that's what happened. And then his clever defense lawyer stood up and asked, well, did you have your lights on? Well, interestingly, at that time of the year, there were adverts going out on the television. You might remember them. You remember the ones that said, think once, think bike. Well, the adverts at that time also encouraged all cyclists, no matter what time of the day it was, to keep their headlights on. And I was doing that. And so I started to say to the judge, well, there's an advertising campaign going out. And he said, stop. That is not evidence. That is not your story. Evidence can only be what you experience firsthand. Just because Joe Bloggs down the road said it and you heard it doesn't mean it's evidence. You have got to have experienced Jesus yourself to be able to share Jesus with others. And that is the key evidence that we need to bring. And that's why we have been called to give evidence as witnesses. So we come to the passage that David read so well for us a minute or two ago on the example of a testimony. Here we have the Apostle Paul. He's in a court of law. There's a big fella on one corner who is the Roman governor called Festus. But actually, in front, in the judge's seat, was a chap called Agrippa, Herod Agrippa, great-grandson of the chap who tried to kill Jesus and killed the babies in Bethlehem. And this Agrippa was quite familiar with Christian things of what was happening in his country. So Paul stood up and was given the opportunity to give his evidence, his personal story. Now, if you look at this passage, he says this, all the Jews know my way of life from my youth. I belong to the strictest sect of Pharisees. I cast my vote against believers. I locked them up. I. He experienced this because he had done it. And for all we know, he tortured innocent women who are believers to force them to deny Jesus. And he would have possibly tortured them in front of their husbands and did the same with them to try and get them to turn away from faith. And they refused to do so. So if you look at this part of his evidence, how would you describe what he's telling us here, or what he was telling King Agrippa? Anyone shout it out? This is what he was like in his past, before he had met Christ. This is the structure that every testimony ought to follow. I'll show you this in a minute. And then we move on. He stops at that. He moves next, and he says, look, And again, it's first-hand evidence. I was traveling. I saw. I heard. And this is what I heard and saw. And this, of course, is when he met Jesus on the road, the blinding light that dropped him to his feet, then the voice, and then the words. That Jesus said, look, why are you persecuting me? I am Jesus. And not just that, I've got a mission for you, Paul. What's that mission? You are going to be sent out, I'm sending you, to turn people from darkness to light, from the power of Satan to God, so that they can be forgiven for their sins. The one tremendous thing that Christianity offers that no other religion in the world can guarantee is that when you meet Jesus, all your sins are forgiven. Your past, your present, and your future. That yes, what you will still do, all are forgiven because he has died to take them all. And that is the heart of the message. That's the bit in the middle, and that's what Paul explained to Agrippa. And then he says that I didn't disobey that. I went out and did that. So if the first bit was the past, the middle bit was how he met Jesus, what's the next bit here in this final paragraph? What he did next. The future, as it were. The past, present, and future of meeting Jesus. Now that is the structure and example of any testimony. And it is a sandwich. Now, for those vegetarians, you'll see this is a cheese sandwich. But some of you, if you're not, can imagine a little bit of ham stuck in the middle. But the key thing is it's got two outer bits. It's got before. It's got the middle bit, the core. That is what the real essence is. How you met Jesus and what exactly you thought, saw, and happened. And then it's got, on the edge of it, the change, the response. And so what was he like before? And the focus, remember, in the testimony is on that spiritual understanding and journey. Paul did not go into the details of the temperature of the sun at the time of the journey or the sweat all over his body or whatever. He focused on the spiritual experience so that the hearers could understand that they spiritually need to change. And that's how he explained his conversion. And he emphasized what he saw, what he heard, and how he felt, that blindness and change. And then he went on to explain what next. Notice the focus of a testimony is not on you, it's all about Jesus. It's back to my court scene. When I was in front of the judge is not interested in how you feel or had any particular imaginations about things, or you heard from others, or what you saw on the telly. The judge is interested in what happened to you concerning this incident, and in this case, concerning Jesus. Our focus must entirely be on him. Paul did not focus on his own self. So, what we're going to do now is you're going to pick up that piece of paper and have a look at it. What I'm going to encourage you to do is think through your testimony. Now, you may not have one, but you may want to at least think through what could happen to you. And if you're in that position, then please do speak to some of us afterwards. But when I became a Christian, I was 17 years old. I can still remember exactly where it was, exactly the time of night. It was the 7th of March. It was 1971. It was 9:30 at night. I can go through other details. You don't need to know that. But the thing that I did next is that in my church that I had been going to, there was a young woman who had been quite an outstanding believer, and she shared her testimony, her story of Jesus, quite freely with anyone in the church. And I was a teenager at the time, so she shared it with us. And she then went off to become a missionary in South America. And after I'd become a Christian, I thought, I really ought to tell someone. And what I did is I got a piece of paper and I wrote out everything I could think of that had happened to me in order to send it off to Burl Murphy out in South America. I didn't send it immediately. I then found it later, and I then rewrote it and I did send it. I held on to the original, and I have still got it 50 plus years afterwards. I then, a few years ago, found it. I then went through it, and I typed up what was in it and added to it. What I'm trying to get to you is that when you write your testimony out, you start to put it's a brain dump at first. You should dump everything onto that piece of paper. Put it all there. But it's like school or university. When you write an essay and then have to explain to someone else, you sift and sort and dispense with most of the information so that you can focus on the key points that need to be shared. So let's take a look at thinking through your testimony. I want you to do something and write on that piece of paper. You should have a pen, and keep the pen, by the way, or the pencil. But look at your little piece of paper. It's simply asking this. Think back through your story in the 3 bits of the sandwich. What were you like before you became a Christian? Now, yes, general upbringing and things like that, but the key thing is, what did you think about religion or spirituality? You may have been brought up in a different tradition. It may have been, I don't know, Muslim, Buddhist, Catholic, who knows? But whatever, what was your religion like beforehand? Secondly, what was your understanding about God at that time? What did you feel about Christians, that funny crowd? What did you feel about when someone might have shared a bit of the gospel to you? Did you reject? What did you feel about it? And above all, what did you think about Jesus? Who is he? Who was it? What was your understanding before you met Jesus? And then the next thing we're going to look at, of course, is the heart of it. What happened that made the change? Meeting Jesus. Where were you? When was it? How old were you? What was the background? Was it a church, or was it out in the open air? Was it at school? Was it at university? Was it at college? Was it at work? Did somebody just talk to you? Who was there? What did they say? Was there a particular phrase or incident or something that came clear to you? It's that moment the penny drops. That is so critical to understand. And many people want to know, what exactly makes you Christians tick? They want to poke you in the ribs and find out, what exactly did you grasp, understand, do, say? And what was your response to it? What did you think at the time? Did you pray? What did you say? You can think it through. But that is an important element so that others can connect with you and pick out something that they have yet to do or understand. And of course, how did you respond? Well, if I was at a public meeting and Billy Graham was there, I came up to the front, and then I met someone, and I then prayed with them. I read the Bible at the time. I remember my own situation. I was in my own home, in my bedroom, and there's nobody there, although I had just been to a youth fellowship weekend with a bishop was there, and many others are encouraging me to faith. But I got there with the New Testament, the Bible on my own, little black King James version. I read through the Sermon on the Mount, and I started at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount and read through again and stopped. Seek ye first the kingdom of God. And that was the moment. Now, what changed? I then prayed and asked Jesus into my heart. What new thoughts did you have? What actions did you take? Help people find, as you did, to find Jesus. And what has changed since? New relationships, new behavior, church, fellowship. Keep it current. Don't think it exists frozen in formaldehyde. Keep your testimony current. How has God used you since? As the Apostle Paul said, and it was probably 14 or 15 years after he'd been converted when he gave his testimony, he said, well, since then, I've preached to the Jews in Jerusalem. I've gone off to Damascus, yes. I've been out to Gentiles. I've been round 3 times. He'd been round the known world, bringing many thousands of people to Jesus. He kept his testimony up to date. Why? Because he was illustrating the power of God in using him from that change. Now, these are just using the example of Paul. But if you turn through and look at Paul's Oh, that's interesting. That shouldn't be there. Anyhow, it should be there, but not that low down the page. Anyhow, when you've written these things out, go back home, think and pray through them, and then read through your evidence. But when you have the opportunity to share it, you should start selecting very carefully from that evidence. Why do I say that? In the book of Acts, in Acts 26, Paul appeared in front of King Agrippa and gave his testimony. Several chapters before that, he appeared in front of the Jewish council, in front of the Sanhedrin, and he was in the temple. One audience, Festus, Roman, he would have spoken Latin. Felix would have understood Latin. He was the king. But in front of the Jews in the Sanhedrin, he spoke in Hebrew. He spoke their language. And he started immediately with, I was a Pharisee. Well, half the crowd he was speaking to were Pharisees. He is immediately linked with the crowd. In other words, you don't give your testimony the same way to every audience. You can't. There are two reasons which we'll come on to in a minute. But the key thing is you must connect with the audience. It is more important what they think than what you think. And don't get emotionally bound up and get too absorbed in yourself. Keep listening and thinking, what is it that they need to know from my story that is relevant to them? And that's what Paul did. And of course, there is a third account in the book of Acts of Paul's testimony. Can anyone tell me where it is? If you've got chapter 22 in front of the Jews and chapter 26 in front of Agrippa, go right back to the first one. Where was that? Yeah, go on. Oh, sorry, I've given it there. Sorry, you're looking at the same notes as me. You're cheating. The key thing is in the start of the Luke's account, and that's the story he had told to Luke, and Luke gave a more factual, as it were, explanation of it. But can you see where we're coming here? That each audience needs a different view and needs to understand. You're not changing who you are or what happened, but rather you're targeting the audience. I hope this works when I click the next one. Oh, this is going to be fun. It's going to fall off the end of the page. But I did say there are a couple of points when you're presenting your testimony, and there's two. And these are golden rules. Now, they don't apply to sermons, Barry. You're all right. Sermons can go on forever. But testimony, if you focus on the audience, they need to be short and succinct, not wander and not get too lost. We need to shape what we say to the listener that they might understand and select the key points that relate to them. And of course, as I said earlier, the focus is on Jesus. It's not on us, it's him. It is testimony. It is not autobiography. If you want to write your life story, away you go, publish it. But when we give testimony, we're there standing, as it were, before the judge, giving evidence. Short, sweet, clear. I've said structure the presentation, and the next one, you know the structure. It's before, what happened, and then after. And I'm curious to know what happens when I press this button. Oh, there we go. I think I've got 3 more points, and you're only going to see one on the screen. The key one is, of course, be yourself. Avoid jargon. I come from Northern Ireland. You'd never have guessed. And in Northern Ireland, we have very strong traditions of evangelical Christianity that is oh, how can I describe it? I better not. You're English, or you wouldn't understand. Anyhow, when I hear testimonies in Northern Ireland, they would be sort of, I was gloriously saved out of my transgressions, and I was bound in sin and nature's night, and God gloriously raised me up to the mighty majesty of his position, and dramatically redeemed me and saved me, and brought me into his light. Can you see a problem there with any of that I've described? Firstly, did any of you understand anything I've just said? Well, that's how I've heard many testimonies back home. In other words, Christians too often, their only experience of giving testimony is to a home audience, to Christians. And they therefore get into jargon, cliches, biblical phrases which are gloriously true, but mean absolutely nothing to the listener. Guess where they've made a stupid mistake? And the other thing about testimony is it's never meant to be given to Christians in churches. Testimony isn't giving telling your story to churches, because that's not having the effect Jesus intended. Testimony is before a hostile audience, in a court, as it were, or before people who don't believe, to share with them Jesus in order that they might believe. Do you get the difference? I'm not saying don't share testimonies with fellow believers in church. You'll see I'm going to completely contradict myself in a minute. But the intended audience that Jesus intended is not the people sat here necessarily. It could be, but it's not your home crowd. It is those who do not know, and that is so important. So therefore, we need to speak the same language. And there are several other things. I hope they come up. I'll be amazed what's going to happen next. Yes, it's just down there below it. I'll read it out for you, though. The key thing next is this. Avoid inappropriate details and strictly avoid exaggeration. And it is often in the heat of a moment, quite often, Christian believers are totally unprepared to give their testimony. Do you know why? Because you haven't thought it through, you haven't written it out, you haven't prepared it, and you haven't practiced it for different audiences. And that is so critical, because it is important in our testimony to glorify God and focus on Him, but not on your sin. And there are many aspects of either what happened to you or what you did that are either embarrassing or should not be shared with every audience. And therefore, one needs to think more carefully as to what is the core and the essence of what we're trying to share here. The last 2 points of these, the next point is this. Focus on the listener and respect them. When I was a young man in my early 20s at university in Belfast, I was in part of a group, and they would go down on a Thursday afternoon at lunchtime. They would put up a little thing that looked like an ice cream stand that said National Young Life Campaign, whoever they are, and then they would put a little box up, and you would stand on top of this soapbox, and then people would speak and share their testimony. And I remember well the university lecturer who headed this up, Mike Barry. He would be preaching, or not preaching, he'd be sharing the good news with the crowd, and somebody would interrupt, and there'd be this drunk would say, "Where did Cain get his wife from then, eh?" And throwing irrelevant questions. And Mike, this distinguished senior lecturer, would say, "Sir, thank you for your question. Number one, respect the hearer, regardless of what you or others might think of them. Sir," and then, "if I might say so, sir, I think it is too easy to get involved with other people's wives and not think of our own relationships." And then he would turn that to our relationship with God. He was able to turn it around politely. And at the end, he would say, "Sir, have I answered your question?" Constant respect. And we need to respect the other person more than we almost respect ourselves. And that is such an important thing. And do stop when you're giving your story, because it's too easy to get into auto-send. Sorry about preachers again, Barry. I'm as guilty. It's too easy to do that. Stop and then say, have you understood what I've just said? Have you any questions about what I've just explained to you? Do you want to ask me anything that I haven't covered? And that is so important. It is a two-way conversation, as it was Jesus and the examples he gave in the Gospels. And then the final point on testimony is this simply, and I did raise it earlier, practice, practice, practice. Share it with your wife, your brother, your sister, your friends. Share it with other believers. Say, look, I've gone through my testimony. I've written it out here. I've got a few key points. And then the first thing you do is you turn over the page where you've written it out and you hide it. You've got to memorize it and know where you're going and say, right, and you then explain it. And let another believer listen to it. And then they'll sort of shake their head and say, why did you go on for 15 minutes on that thing? And I didn't realize that. And that is important. Because we do need to make sure, if we're giving evidence before the unbelievers of this world to bring them into the kingdom of God's light of Christ, then we need certainly to be able to be succinct, clear, short, accurate, but targeted on their needs. I don't know if this last slide will come up, but this is the case. Testimonies. If we don't tell them, who will? Christ has no hands but ours, no tongues but ours, no help but ours to bring men and women, boys and girls, to his side. We're called to be his witnesses, wherever that is, the ends of the earth. Let's work at how we share that most precious gift of salvation that God has given, that change, and be able to share that and give it to others, that they too might experience Jesus for themselves.